So thank you all for coming today. I appreciate this. This is going to be broadcast on the state internet and live streaming. We are very fortunate today on so many fronts, but I just want to take a moment and introduce Douglas Brinkley to Rhode Island State House. I'm absolutely thrilled he's here today. Professor Brinkley is an author, presidential historian, a CNN commentator, and a Vanity Fair magazine contributing editor. And as everyone here knows, he's the most read environmentalist. Doug is also a truly expert in the field of environmental sciences. So I was incredibly proud when our mutual friend, Doug and I's friend Liz Perrick, made an introduction. Doug was not only interested in the work we've done in Rhode Island, and particularly in the House over the past 2 years regarding environmental initiatives. As many people in this room know, we have had what many environmental advocates call the best 2 years of environmental policy making in Rhode Island history. Much of this is thanks to the hard work of Rep. Carson and Terri Cortvriend, sponsors of the landmark Act on Climate. I would like to acknowledge Lita Blazachewski, who's also been a long-time advocate for the Act on Climate and many other environmental initiatives. Chris, thank you. Earlier today, the leader, Rep. Carson, and myself had the opportunity to meet with Professor Brinkley and discuss many of the issues that we're facing nationally and locally. Representative Carson and Cortvriend also took Professor Brinkley on a tour of some of the most environmentally sensitive areas of Rhode Island. Rhode Island is a leader in national environmental initiatives, and we need to be. As the ocean state, we are already seeing the impacts of climate change and sea level rise right here at our own backyards. Literally, in my backyard, in my hometown of Warwick, I am seeing more erosion and rising tides. So we just can't rest on our laurels and be happy for what we have already accomplished. As Professor Brinkley works to help us understand that we need to be part of a process as we go forward. We are simply temporary but critical custodians of the legacy of environmental future. As Doug outlined so eloquently in his writing, environmental advocacy has been taking place in our nation for decades, beginning around the time of Teddy Roosevelt and FDR, and really gaining momentum in the 60s. Then, as they do now, the public looked at those of us in government to take action. The author we're about to hear from has advised multiple presidents on policy and issues. Next week, he's meeting with Vice President Kamala Harris. I am thrilled to introduce Professor Douglas Brinkley, who will share insights from his book, Silent Spring Revolution. Doug, thank you very much for coming to Rhode Island. I will just, again, thank you, but tell you that we stop promptly at 4 from the house. So you have to sorry. So if you have any kind of question and answer period, you'll hear a loud bell go off right around 4 o'clock. Thank you.
Hey, somebody give me the cut sign. I know this upon me. I won't take it personal. What an honor to be here. I've had a great time going around your beautiful ocean state in Newport, and it's anytime you get to speak to an august body like this, it's a great treat. My book, the reason I'm here, Silent Spring Revolution, really emerged when I was a little kid. I know there's here in Providence, there's some problems with children getting asthma from industrial pollution. I had asthma as a boy, and I used to find relief when I got fresh air. And my parents were teachers, so I got to go all over the country as a boy in a trailer. And wherever I went, to visit, whether it's the Grand Canyon or Yellowstone or Big Bend or the Olympics or Cape Cod or Williamsburg, Virginia, wherever I go, somewhere the name Theodore Roosevelt or Franklin D. Roosevelt was around. They saved so many things. And since TR had asthma, as a boy, I kind of adopted Theodore Roosevelt and his outdoor approach, thinking about the natural world as a child might do, as identified with his breathing issue, and I had it, and he became president. I got over that as I grew up. But I did have my own kids, and I have 3 kids. And I decided it would be smart to write a book on Theodore Roosevelt, his crusade for America. How did TR preserve 234 million acres of wild America? How did Theodore Roosevelt from 1901 to 1909 create today's U.S. Forest Service? And on one day, just 100 national forests. He created, I had lunch with a leader of the Audubon Society here. Well, TR wasn't just an Audubonner. He created our first 51 federal bird reservations, which gave birth to U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Where now all of us here, we own over 550 national wildlife refuges. And it was because Theodore Roosevelt was born in 1858, Darwin's On the Origins of Species came out in 1859, and TR's father was a progenitor of the American Museum of Natural History. Roosevelt was a naturalist. He went to Harvard majoring in what today we call wildlife biology. He wrote his first book, Theodore Roosevelt, The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks. He wrote a book called The Deer Family as President. And so I wanted to bring my kids to those parks that Theodore Roosevelt saved, like Muir Woods redwood trees in California, or Devil's Tower in Wyoming, and do a kind of family trips. And I could combine research with it. So I wrote my first book, The Wilderness Warrior. And at that point I decided that I realized that there were 2 other waves, because I do presidential history commentary. And I can tell you, because I study the presidents, there have been 3 great waves of environmental movement. The conservation / environment. Theodore Roosevelt, second wave, FDR, and I wrote a book called Rightful Heritage about FDR's era. You know, wherever Franklin Roosevelt was, they put in the forms what his job was, he would write tree farmer. He ran a scientific forest on the Hudson River. Born along the Hudson, lived his life along the Hudson, buried at the Hudson River. And in fact, I mean, that Hudson River movement saved the Hudson, which, you know, he was a big early leader in that FDR. And he saved, guys, we could talk about national parks and things, but Franklin Roosevelt led to the creation of 800 state parks. 800 across the United States. In addition, you could do, you know, Channel Islands, or, you know, I say Isle Royal in Michigan, or Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, and you could do all the rest of that. Do you realize the New Deal's Civilian Conservation Corps, taking unemployed men paid $1 a day, planting billions of trees during the Great Depression? Close to 3 billion trees got planted because the Great Depression, we had destroyed our environment. It wasn't just that the stock market tumbled. It was we had destroyed the landscape of America. We had species going extinct on us. We had no flyways done. We had drained all wetlands. We had clear-cut forests for so-called energy needs. We had the Dust Bowl in the Midwest. It was problematic. And yet that second wave of environmentalists, Rosalie Edge, Eleanor Roosevelt, Harold Ickes, and others working with FDR did it. They created a second wave. My book is the third wave. And the third wave is closer to our life. I wanted to begin the third wave with John F. Kennedy running in 1960. That's where I thought I'd begin my book, and I thought it ended in 73. I picked the right ending date, 1973. But it didn't really begin in 1960, the environmental movement, the third wave. It began in 1945 with World War II, because as FDR would be Dr. New Deal, became Dr. Win the War. And to win the war and get out of the Depression, we just started manufacturing everything willy-nilly. We didn't have a regulatory structure for new chemicals, new types of plastics, new types of asbestos or lead, and particularly problematic, and where I begin the book, is once we won World War II with dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was a game changer. Humans can blow the world up to smithereens. And in Nevada, actually in the United States from 1945 to 1992, we detonated the US in experiments 1,054 nuclear weapons. And that we had downwinders, not just people near Nevada proving grounds that happen to be a poor rancher or a Navajo miner, but people got sick all over the West, and it blew across the country. The blowing in the wind, a blowing of the nuclear contaminants far and wide. And we also have the problem of DDT. Another thing that helped us win World War II. God bless DDT. I saw you pictures here a minute ago. Jack Kennedy would have been sprayed in DDT, and Richard Nixon, and Lyndon Johnson. If you went to the Pacific, you were saying, douse me in DDT. It kills lice, kills mosquitoes, it kills ticks. What was there not to like? DDT helped us win the war. But the consequences on the natural world and human life, public health concerns, only became publicly an awareness to them in the 1950s. And in my book, I write about how after 45, these strands, that there were about, just like here in Rhode Island today, I'm dealing with climate, you guys are having there. Today I've been talking to people who are doing seashore preservation or plastics, or I'm working on urban poverty issues and environment, or there are these lanes, and the lanes have leaders. The leaders in the United States in the 50s were not the Truman administration or the Eisenhower administration. It was grassroots, and it came from people ranging to, when I write about Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson should be mandatory reading in the school of Rhode Island, not for the book Silent Spring, but for her books on the ocean. She wrote a trilogy of beautiful books about the sea. She was from Springdale, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, grew up along the Allegheny River, never saw an ocean. The Allegheny had glue factories. They destroyed the landscape. It was heinous, but she still found joys in the woodlands near her house. She had a creative writing bent, literary bent. She wrote for magazines as a girl. She also loved science, and she came near here. Woods Hole, Massachusetts is the first time Rachel Carson from the hinterlands of Pennsylvania saw the ocean. And she started studying things like the patterns of migratory eels, which had these extraordinary journeys. She started collecting shrimp and mussels to study. Woods Hole was the research hub, in many ways still is, for ocean studies in the world. And she would write for the Baltimore Sun. And in World War II, she was hired by U.S. Fish and Wildlife to write radio scripts. She did some work for BBC on radio. She wrote about shad and the cod and how the environment and fish stocks interact. And she nailed it with 3 best-selling books on the oceans that still haven't been beaten. She was a progenitor for Jacques Cousteau and others writing about ocean studies. Largely forgotten about John F. Kennedy is he wanted to do oceans as much as he did going to the moon. I wrote the main book about Kennedy called American Moonshot, but he also wanted to do ocean conservation studies, ways to protect and save the oceans in a very real scientific way. And in fact, I mentioned Kennedy because it's here in New England. Rachel Carson living on the east, and a young John F. Kennedy in the 1950s, Kennedy was not a workhorse legislator. He was a bit of a show horse. He happened to have an abiding interest in seashore protection. And it came out of William O. Douglas, the Supreme Court Justice, who was a family friend. It came out of Rose Kennedy, who worshipped Henry David Thoreau. The Kennedy kids learned to swim in Walden Pond of Thoreau's because it was like a baptism. He's the leader of environmentalism, Henry David Thoreau, in many ways. And Thoreau wrote a book called Cape Cod. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend Thoreau's book, Cape Cod. But Kennedy in the mid-1950s was startled as a senator by a report about our vanishing shorelines. It blew him over. It showed how little of our beaches were open to the public. That oceans were being privatized, balkanized, jerseyized, dredged, private condos, hotels, everything, with no just open beaches for people. And that this was going to create a problem. A country as great as ours, why isn't our National Park Service doing something? Why are states saving the beaches for public beaches? Kennedy got on a high horse with it and started fighting for it. And lo and behold, once he became president, he led to the establishment of Cape Cod National Seashore, not that far from here. The reason Cape Cod, guys, is hard. I have to deal with reporters like write about presidents and say, well, didn't Jimmy Carter save more land? And it's easy to save 1 million acres of the Brooks Range in Alaska. It's rock. You want to try saving Cape Cod land? Look at the fights you guys have in Rhode Island over access to beach. Big beach parks are hard politically. Kennedy drove home as president Cape Cod National Seashore. He saved in Texas, Padre Island. He saved Point Reyes. You know where Point Reyes is? Marin County. You want to talk about expensive real estate? Because we had to save the integrity of our ocean and shoreline fronts. And with that spirit, with Rachel Carson's books and Kennedy believing in shorelines, there became those two waves of anti-DDT spraying. DDT meaning the problem was after World War II with DDT, crop planes, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Suffolk County would spray, and people got sick. But more than that, more than wildlife dying at research centers like Pawtuxet in Maryland, which FDR created to study contaminants on waters, we saw how bad it was for the fish and the birds, and that it was the eagle was going extinct. You know, the amount of bird species that were perishing due to pesticides. And Rachel Carson was trying to write an article for Reader's Digest about the perils of DDT. They rejected her. But she collected as insider all this Washington documentation of reports of how dangerous DDT was to human health. And then in the late 50s, a woman forgotten named Marjorie Spock. Do any of you here remember Dr. Benjamin Spock, a baby doctor?
Oh, yeah.
Well, this was his sister. And she lived in Suffolk, Long Island. And she wanted to be one thing in life, an organic farmer. Not that unusual today we have Whole Foods, and all this everywhere. But in that period, I could only grow organic produce. And do you know what? She sued for being sprayed. That I have a God-given right to be an organic farmer. Nobody can spray chemicals over my land. Some of you here are lawyers and have a legal bent. It's an interesting statutory crime. Who owns the air above us? Right? I mean, just by nature, if a law school, you're going to give a seminar, it's fascinating and, debate. Well, she sued and took it all the way to the Supreme Court and lost. But in that loss was the beginning of that third wave environmental movement, because Marjorie Spock gave to Rachel Carson all of the legal findings, and the environmental green justice William O. Douglas of Yakima, Washington, who had recently hiked to to stop a highway being built. He walked 186 miles as Supreme Court Justice from Washington, D.C. to Cumberland, Maryland to save the C&O Canal as a cultural and national treasure. And Douglas wrote a dissent that's just brilliant, defending Spock in her right for organic farming. And now Rachel Carson starts writing her book, Silent Spring, and she has cancer. She has breast cancer. She's talking, here's doctors from the Cleveland Clinic and Mayo and Hopkins, and it's metastasizing. And she's racing against the clock to write her book. And she finally finishes it. She lost all of her hair through chemo, wore a wig, didn't go out, didn't give speeches, worked on her book. And in January of '62, she finished it. William O. Douglas got an early copy of it. This is a pre-Environmental Protection Agency America. The closest thing to an EPA may have been Bill Douglas's Supreme Court desk, because he was an avid Thoreauvian hiker, outdoors person who took in Buddhism as a baby after he hiked the Himalayan mountains and wrote a book, The Himalayas, as a Supreme Court justice. Happened to get hired by Joe Kennedy to run the stock market exchange and was Kennedy's justice. Very close to the Kennedy family, William O. Douglas. He tells Rachel Carson, we're going to put the pesticides chemical on notice. Because what Carson and Douglas did in '62 was do something that Theodore Roosevelt and FDR didn't do. Rachel Carson told the constituents, the voters of places like Rhode Island, your kid can be getting sick playing in the backyard. It's not about saving a rock monument in Utah. That's great. But how many people can afford to go to Arches and, take family vacations like I had the privilege of? A lot of people don't have that privilege. But your kids are getting sick in their local playgrounds. They can't swim in their local river. They can't go in the ocean because the beach is shut today due to contamination. And that we are all getting cancer, leukemia, and we're dying because nobody regulated these pesticides, and plastic companies just mass producing this stuff, changing the way agriculture is done, changing the way we live, putting preservatives and chemicals in all of our foodstuffs, etc. All Carson and Douglas were saying, shouldn't these companies be regulated? And her book comes out. But famously, John F. Kennedy's asked about it, and he said the best answer any president could say, it may not sound like much, it might even sound like a whimper, but he had said, Douglas compared her book to Uncle Tom's Cabin during the Civil War, Silent Spring, and created all this noise. Kennedy said, look, I read this, Carson, and I'm going to put a group of scientists together and determine what the truth is. And then we're going to act. It'd be like if you have a problem with a company shell or something, and if there's a debate, there is an answer. What's the scientific answer of what the problem is? And alas, that sparks everything. Kennedy's, of course, killed in November of '63. Rachel Carson's dead in '64. But out of the movement to ban DDT, to regulate pesticides, was born the DDT Wars. And it went on from 1962 to 1972. And you know who finally had the guts to ban DDT? Richard Nixon. And William Ruckelshaus in '72 was a decade of intense fightings. The chemical pesticide companies started against Rachel Carson's movement. And out of all of this was born today's environmental law. I was just talking to a wonderful professor from Roger Williams and talking about all university law schools have environmental law now, and it's everywhere. This is it. It became the Environmental Defense Fund was created, EDF, under the slogan, sue the bastards. EDF said the only way we're going to win is for states like Rhode Island to sue the polluters, for Wisconsin to sue the polluters. And not just that, there are other brave voices. You guys talk about environmental justice, it's like a buzzword we throw around now. Man, you want to know who really kicked all that off? Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the Farm Workers Union in California, where kids of Mexican American birth, but also undocumented workers, were getting sick because of pesticides just being dumped on them. Children deformed, cancer rates spiking up. Chavez becomes a major figure on his strikes against the growers, and then later in his life he becomes an organic farmer. And environmental justice, you know what Dr. King said? We do Martin Luther King Day. And you hear all these quotes of Dr. King. You know one they don't spin in the media much? Dr. King said, essentially, what good does it do to integrate a lunch counter? In Greensboro, North Carolina, Rhodes. What good does it do to integrate a lunch counter if the milk you're drinking has strontium-90 in it? Fallout radiation from Nevada test. Where are we making our children sick? I mean, so Coretta Scott King led all of the protests to stop nuclear testing. And if you want to talk about leadership in politics, I'll give you leadership. John F. Kennedy's nuclear test ban treaty of 1963. Kennedy had the temerity and the guts. First off, he listened to Norman Cousins, who was the editor of the Saturday Literary Review, who wrote the first essay criticizing Nagasaki bomb and problems of nuclear fallout. And Cousins then created SANE, a group protesting nuclear testing. So Cousins could be marginalized as an activist if you're president. But Kennedy looked out his window and saw women striking for the anti-bomb movement. Thousands of women, Dagmar Wilson, Women Strike for Peace. And he called the president. Imagine a strike in front of you, and he calls Dagmar Wilson and says, I see you're striking out my window. You know. And you know what he does after the Cuban Missile Crisis? He sends Norman Cousins behind the back of CIA and State Department and Defense as his private envoy to meet with the Vatican, the Pope, and Khrushchev. It says, we've got to stop nuclear testing. Russia and the United, we've got to, ecologically, for health reasons, not just in a course, obviously, stop the world from blowing up. The insanity of making people sick with our testing. And Kennedy led the way to ban with the nuclear test ban as a great ecological leadership moment. The problem what I'm hoping to address in my book is we need to praise politicians like our speaker and for caring about the environment and having ecological leadership. It's just as important as business leadership, labor leadership. Incidentally, guys, beyond in the 60s, they finally, you know why they got the Clean Air Act? You guys have to deal with one way or another. The first one came in December 63, second one in December 1970, our Clean Air Acts that we're living by off of really today. I mean, Bush 41 did an amendment, etc. But the impetus of it all was Donora, Pennsylvania, where an entire city got sick from poisons from factories that were polluting the area. They weathered, inverted, and 20 people died, and the whole community got rushed to emergency wards from dirty air. That's the birthplace of smog, is Donora, Pennsylvania. London had just thousands of people dying from smog. It used to be you couldn't breathe in Los Angeles or New York until these laws came into effect and had some teeth in it, and the federal government regulated. Do you realize that we celebrate often Earth Day? The first Earth Day in 1970? But you can ask, I can tell you, I've read histories of Earth Day where people will say, well, Gaylord Nelson, the senator from Wisconsin, was on an air trip. He saw the Vietnam War teach-ins. He thought we'd have a teach-in for the environment. Suddenly, all of America came out, and we had this massive Earth Day in 1970, April 22nd. True. Incredible event. Largest public protest gathering, education, teaching of all time. But I asked myself a simple money our journalist would ask. Where did the money for this come from? who paid for all these Earth Day offices opening up on campuses and in headquarters in DC? And guess what the answer is? The United Auto Workers, Walter Reuther. Labor unions were a major part of the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s. Because Reuther said, my workers, my blue-collar workers, don't have the money to go on jetting around New Zealand or jetting around Alaska. They have to tell their pond in their backyard. They have to go swim in the local lake. They need to have clean water where they live, not poison coming out of their faucets. Reuther was one of the great undersung environmental heroes. He died in a plane accident days after Earth Day with his wife, May. It's a wild story. You can read about the death of the Reuthers. I don't have time today for it. But what I'm starting to tell you guys is these, when you talk about a word movement, there are all these people that are getting involved with it. I mean, we were blessed. I mean, on one hand, Lyndon Johnson, Vietnam War, 58,000 dead, untold, maimed, divided country. But then you have Civil Rights Acts, Voting Rights Acts with Johnson. But you realize that Lady Bird Johnson did so much for the environment as First Lady, and that Lyndon Johnson kept the Kennedy initiative of seashores alive. He saved Fire Island, Lyndon Johnson, Assateague in Maryland and Virginia. They started, first time, everybody treated the Great Lakes as a dumping zone. The novelist Kurt Vonnegut said Lake Erie is dying of Clorox bottles and human excrement. He wasn't wrong. It was dying, Lake Erie. And the Cuyahoga River caught on fire in Cleveland. It shocked Nixon that Neil Armstrong's on the moon. We're supposed to be talking space, and time is showing rivers on fire in America, including the Rouge River in Michigan. And the Great Lakes were treated as a dumping ground. And Johnson moved in with water quality acts, as did Nixon, but also saved places like Sleeping Bear Dunes has opened public sand beach dunes in Michigan, Picture Island, Indiana Dunes. You guys think you have a fight here in New Jersey on the seashore about if somebody should walk in front of a resident's house and it becomes a NIMBY issue? You should see the fight that took place by Gary, Indiana, to save the steel company not wanting any public beach created along the Great Lakes. It was brutal. And often artists become the leaders. Carl Sandburg, grand old poet. Some of you may remember his name and some don't. Became the front guy for saving the Great Lakes beaches. Ansel Adams, the great photographer, became the person saving our national parks with his iconic photographs. Johnson did two things. The Wilderness Act, big, roadless wilderness designation, 1,000,000 acres, no roads. Roads bring development. You can't have a pristine environment. He pushed that through. But more importantly, wild and scenic rivers. And he also did the Appalachian Trail, Johnson, Pacific Crest Trail, the National Trails Act. But with what Kennedy and Johnson were both saying, like the Roosevelts before, is outdoor recreation is a birthright in America. Clean air and clean water should be birthrights. Nobody should be being raised in a toxic slum dump neighborhood. And guess where those neighborhoods were? Where people of color lived. And it happened then and it happens now. Where poor people live, all of the debris of society gets dumped. And there are incidences in Houston, which was the worst city of them all. In Virginia, Fort Myers, Florida, people would sell in poor black neighborhoods. They build new sub-developments on toxic waste sites and not even tell them they were living on a toxic waste site. It's a serious issue. John Lewis was a leader of it later, really, in the 80s. Andy Young and Dr. King were onto it. This idea that only wealthy people get to live in a healthy environment is wrong. Morally wrong, and we have to talk about environmental justice issues all the time. You might say Nixon. What is it with Richard Nixon? You know, I've been in here in your guys' State House, and I've seen Nixon photos around. I've seen a lot of Kennedy. Might be coastal difference. Nixon was a transactional politician. He came in '68 and when he ran, and so many reporters were coming up to him asking environmental questions, and Nixon, like, that's not my thing. He was from California, and like in Rhode Island, you can't be in politics in Rhode Island, right, and not deal with environmental issues one way or another. So, you know, he was facile at it to a certain limited degree. But he had hired John Ehrlichman and went to prison for Watergate. And Ehrlichman was a public land and water lawyer out of Seattle. And the Sierra Club called Ehrlichman a covert green. And all that Nixon told Ehrlichman was, you handle the environment. I'll sign it as long as Ed Muskie and Ted Kennedy's name aren't on it. He loathed particularly Muskie of Maine. Meaning Nixon's Ehrlichman had a partner in Henry M. Jackson, Scoop Jackson, Democrat from Washington. Because Scoop was pro-Vietnam War Democrat and an environmentalist. So Nixon said, if Scoop does it, if his office does it, I'll sign something with Scoop, invite him to the White House, put my arms around him, and I'll get credit for it. What triggered Nixon's environmentalism is the trauma of the Santa Barbara oil spill. As you guys all know, crises will do that. You have another hurricane come here, or you have a massive flood going on, the crisis makes people rethink. If your seawater intrusion along coastal Rhode Island has taken over, the 7 ponds where you're getting your fresh water from is suddenly contaminated with intrusion, you wake up. You become an environmentalist overnight. And Nixon had to do that with Santa Barbara oil spill. He was living in San Clemente. It'd be like Newport in muck. Just destroyed, ducks and birds trying to move from the beach and they couldn't. He had an Interior Secretary, Walter Hickel, who gave Nixon a good bit of advice if you're advising a representative here working as a chief of staff. He saw it, Hickel, and told Nixon, don't minimize. Just say it is as bad as everybody says it is. We'll worry about the legal ramifications later, but don't cover it up. Or don't make it seem minor. I hate it when there's a terrible oil spill where politicians act like, oh, it's not that bad, we'll put a Band-Aid on it. Just admit it's awful. The Nixon then went on, on Earth Day, that first one I mentioned, Nixon was worried it was infiltrated, the Earth Day, the environmental movements were socialist pinko commies. I'm not saying that, he wrote that in letter, just that. He said, I'm worried it's a trick, a Trojan horse environmentalism of the left, and to attack the corporate right. But Nixon also didn't want to be the GOAT, not as the greatest of all time, meaning the worst of the environment. So he planted a tree with Pat, in photos, so Earth Day, but it's participatory. Plant the tree, it was so he went against Earth Day. He gave Interior Department employees the day off to be part of the teach-in. But he then also put FBI surveillance on all the youth groups and did wire bugging, tapping, getting any information. And some of the historians, we read other people's mail for a living. Some of the funniest mail I've ever read is watching Pete McCloskey, used to be a Republican from California and an environmental Republican. And his letter exchanges with Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman saying, I gotta go tell Nixon that we got the big FBI reports and the secret spying, and nothing happened but some kids kissing and fondling under the beach. That dogs running around, people throwing a frisbee, a little pot with smoke. There is no conspiracy. It was young people caring about America the Beautiful. Isn't that what you want your young people to do? Is to go up and say, I want our beaches saved, I want our forests saved, I want clean air. We want them to be that. But Nixon he got to Earth Day and said, wow, I'm going to go for it. And he created the Environmental Protection Agency in the summer of 1970. Out of the White House. Scoop Jackson and John Dingell of Michigan, part of it, and others. A big, great list of, people worked on EPA. But Nixon brings it and opens it in 1970. And here's the problem that you guys face in politics with EPA. If I had to reinvent the world, EPA should have got a little bit like a magical creature. When you think of the EPA, you think of Bambi or something. You think it's law enforcement. And because Nixon had signed NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, on January 1, 1970, and NEPA was a revolution because NEPA and the National Environmental Policy Act created environmental impact statements. What does that do, guys? Look at the new jobs for environmental lawyers. Any business. CVS wants to build a new facility along here. What's the impact statement of you building this? What's the environmental impact statement of a new museum being built or a casino going up? Or it makes environmental law become important. And this generation now is the beneficiaries of the birth of environmental law in the 60s and 70s under the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations and Congress, of course. But not only and so William Ruckelshaus, a very honest Republican from Indiana, first head of the EPA, he would just bust people. Because you know how we have Brown versus Topeka and civil rights? And what is it, Brown versus Topeka? Integration, schools. What is the civil rights movement of Dr. King is basically often about implementing Brown. Right? I mean, Little Rock, 1957, it's about integrating Central High. Or Ruby Bridges at France Elementary in New Orleans, integrating it, complying to Brown. The problem became for EPA complying to NEPA. And you have whatever you think companies did not want to comply, up the number you're thinking. Nobody wanted to be regulated by the federal government if you were in oil and gas, if you were in copper mining, if you're in extraction industries, or you're plastics, or you're using rivers for dumping sites. You did not want to comply to NEPA, particularly if you're in the South, where states' rights are popular. Now the federal government's telling me what my company should do. You get it all. So Ruckelshaus had to go there and bust. And you're a polluter, and he made examples. You don't get a sewage treatment plant, you're in defiance, built within a year in Rhode Island, you're not complying to the federal government standards, but we're coming after you. He was FBI kind of guy. And it's made corporate America not like the EPA, because they feel that the federal government is investigating and so in the end, guys, everything you're dealing with today is about compliance for the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act of '72, or the EPA standards, etc. I will stop on Nixon and close with Rhode Island and just tell you that Nixon's last big win was in Endangered Species Act. It's not bringing back the bald eagle and California condor and manatees. Alligators were almost extinct. Hard to believe when you take off at Kennedy Airport or something. The Canada goose was almost extinct. Now they're everywhere to our detriment. But the EPA, the Endangered Species Act. Lawmakers in the audience here, guess what that passed by? 92-0. That's how bipartisan the environmental movement had become by 1973. You ain't getting no 92-0 vote on the environment in America. All right? That's the difference. And I said my book naturally ended at 73 because that's when the movement died, or it hit a new phase of counter-revolution coming after it. 73, Nixon gets mired in Watergate. The extraction, commercial developers, real estate people, traditional Republican constituents were livid at Nixon for acting like an FDR liberal on the environment. They didn't want anything to do with him. You'll hear historians on TV, I hear pundits on tell a story, and Barry Goldwater came and told Nixon, you lied to me, and therefore you lied to the country, and I can't support you over Watergate. EPA, Clean Air and Water. He was punishing Nixon out of Watergate for regulating all of the companies of Arizona that are in the mining industries. We loathe you. We did better with Kennedy than we did with you, Nixon, and he said, you abandoned us. And then also the Arab Oil Embargo of '73. When Nixon sided with Israel, and then you have the OPEC crisis, and what happens? Gasoline pipes go up, inflation, double-digit inflation, and people blame environmentalists. That the environmental movement went too far. This was bound to happen, that America must be energy independent. Exactly what goes on in the same time now when Biden comes in. And then the right, and I don't have time to get into it today because I'm running out on my clock, but the right started a counter-revolution. And it's called, if you care to look, it's called the Lewis-Powell Memorandum of 1971, where Powell begins to say, we're 40 years behind the environmentalists. We have to come up with a counter-swing or we'll be regulated out of business. Socialism will take over capitalism. And they went after Ralph Nader and Rachel Carsonites, etc. But out of this, guys, was born the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, the Koch brothers, the Scafees. All of these groups today on the right are tracking, they were born to counter the Silent Spring Revolution. They weren't worried as much about gender equality and race issues. They can figure that out. Unions, they negotiate prices. What they didn't like is the government looking into what they did. That the demonization of the extraction industries. And they knew they needed to create a new TV network. They knew they needed to get conservative media. They had to create conservative lecture series. They knew that we had to create a whole new counterforce. It came. It's there. And now we're these two sides, instead of bipartisan, we're just hammering at each other. What do? We need a fourth wave. I haven't written the fourth wave. The fourth wave will be with climate action at its centerpiece, and it's global. And yet it starts locally. And I don't think with that divided federal government, you're going to be able to look at a president that does that, or the legislative agenda that does the revolution. It's probably going to be blue states. It's going to be California and Washington State, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, these states when they come and say, we're creating, like we did, like you guys have already started doing here with climate plan, and put a clock on it. And you've got to meet these difficult measures in your state. But if states are willing to do that, 20 states, you're already seeing GM not wanting to go fossil fuels, Ford not wanting to do fossil fuels. You're following what's going on with Tesla electric cars. It may end up being more state legislatures, not the U.S. federal government, that is going to be the leader of the fourth wave politically. The real leaders are going to be Generation Z, the students that are down the road at Brown or University of Rhode Island. It's young people. Because I've been teaching, I'm a professor at Rice University, and I've been teaching a long time from Naval Academy to Hofstra to Tulane. I've never seen a group more environmentally aware than the young people today, 20, let's say, 21, 22. And part of it is all of these earth science classes, Earth Days, things, documentaries, it's helped. They have a vocabulary on climate justice in college now. Do you know how many kids want to major in environmental studies? Staggering. You want to see where, it may be in the public, where does climate change rank as a public concern in the midterm? It might be 4th or 5th. Look at the polls of people in their 20s and you'll see it as number 1. And they are going to be the leaders of it. It's a new generation now. Greta became a symbol of that, right, globally. But there are a lot of Gretas at every school, everywhere, and they're demanding it. And we, in the Rhode Island legislature, needs to listen to them. That's the future. And they know that we have to do things like a bottle law in Rhode Island for depositing. They know that we have to be careful about clear-cutting forests in a reckless way for a quick short-term gain. They know that we need to have a coastal plan of some kind in Rhode Island. They know that we have to make sure that as a historian, that we do restoration of communities, not let them just deteriorate with their infrastructure. There are ideas of softening the shoreline in Rhode Island to help with flooding issues. There's all sorts of people getting involved with wind power. You guys are the leader. What I'm going to try to do to help, as my clock's dying, is to tell you I'm going to try to write about what Rhode Island's doing, because while everyone knows you're the smallest state, they don't realize that Rhode Island is a ground zero operation on the environmental action of today. Because we can see the problems here, you know what they are. If I knew you would clap for that, I would have said stuff like that. So at any rate, I end by telling you it is hopeful. Tell young people to get engaged, and whether it's saving the bay or saving a forest, saving the species, all we're trying to do is make sure our citizens are engaged to keep Rhode Island such a special place in the second half of the 21st century. Thank you all.